The Hebrew Bible never identifies the serpent from the Garden of Eden as Satan, and I would argue that the New Testament doesn't either. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. The fit for this video is the death of Superman. And the Hebrew Bible actually never mentions the serpent from the Garden of Eden again outside of Genesis chapter 3. We don't find it popping up until Greco-Roman period Jewish literature. And no, Ezekiel 28 is not an exception. That's a reference to the king of Tyre. It does not refer to the king of Tyre as the serpent, and also the tradition of the Garden of Eden in that chapter is very different. When we get to 1 Enoch 69, we have Gadrael, the third-ranked angel, identified as the serpent from the Garden of Eden, but this is nowhere identified as Satan. Some scholars identify Wisdom of Solomon 2:24 as a reference to Satan. There it says it was because of the envy of a devil or an adversary that death entered the world. And some people identify this as Satan, but this 2012 article makes a compelling case that the indefinite use of diabolos in this time period probably would have referred to a human adversary, and so most likely this is referring to Cain killing Abel because of envy. The New Testament never identifies the serpent from the Garden of Eden as Satan, at least not clearly. There are scholars who argue that it happens in Revelation 12:9 or 20 verse 2 or in Romans 16:20, but these are not the only interpretations, and I would argue they're not the best interpretations. When we look in Revelation 12 and 20, we see a great red dragon who has 7 heads and who is also a serpent. And this makes the most sense as a reference to Leviathan, which is the only creature that is referred to in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible as both a dragon and a serpent, and as having multiple heads. In Psalm 74, we have a reference to Leviathan as a drakonta, and they have multiple heads. In Isaiah 27:1, we have the story about how in that day Adonai will punish with his great and hard sword Leviathan the wriggling serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, the dragon that lives in the sea. In the Greek translation of this, we have the word for serpent, the same one that we have in Revelation, and we have the word for dragon, the same one we have in Revelation. And this is actually quoting a tradition that we also find several centuries earlier in the Ugaritic literature, where it is Baal, the storm deity, who destroys Leton, the wriggling serpent, the twisting serpent, the dragon with 7 heads. And so the imagery from Revelation does not make sense as the serpent from the Garden of Eden. It makes the most sense as a reference to Leviathan, the primeval, primordial chaos dragon. Now in Romans 16:20, it says the God of peace will shortly crush Satan under your feet. And for a lot of people, this resonates with the curse that God places on the serpent in Genesis 3:15, where God says that the offspring of the woman will strike your head, but you will strike his heel. But the imagery of God placing one's enemies under their feet is actually far more common. In fact, we find it in non-biblical and even non-Jewish and Christian literature in the Greco-Roman world, but it's also in Psalm 8. It is a more generic piece of imagery, and additionally, the Septuagint version of Genesis 3:15 doesn't say anything about crushing. It actually uses a verb that means to keep watch or guard over. And so the idea would be the woman's offspring will look out for your head and you will look out for his heel. So this does not seem to be a reference to Paul's version of Genesis 3:15 in the first place. So I don't think that is a very clear reference either. Now, I think the best case for identifying the serpent from the Garden of Eden with Satan is actually made in the Apocalypse of Abraham, which was probably written around the end of the 1st century CE or the beginning of the 2nd century CE. So contemporaneous with some of the later texts from the New Testament, but it was not included in the New Testament. But in chapter 23, it talks about who the serpent in the Garden of Eden was, and it refers to that serpent as Azazel. If we look in the book of Enoch, chapter 54, we actually have Azazel mentioned as the head of the malevolent angels, and then in a parallel passage, the word Satan is used to refer to the same head of the malevolent angels. And so in the Apocalypse of Abraham, from a couple of centuries later, we have Azazel identified as the serpent from the Garden of Eden. I would argue that is the origin of the identification of the serpent from the Garden of Eden with Satan.